There are a ton of great albums turning 10 in 2017. Seems like 2007 was a huge year, especially for follow-up albums. A lot of bands released either their second or third albums of their time, and it really was a lot of their best work. So, without further ado, here are the top 10 albums turning 10 in 2017.
Number 10.
Number 10 is Chiodos with the Bone Palace Ballet. Now, their last album, All's Well That Ends Well, was a nice introduction to the band. I mean, they had been there before. I believe they had released either one EP or a couple EPs previously, and it really felt like a strong album right out of the gate. It was a bit more experimental than what their counterparts were doing. It was something a little bit different. Craig Owen's voice definitely stood out. The piano work throughout the album, the electronic work throughout the album really kind of felt like they were doing something different, and that's kind of how they made a name for themselves, besides the fact that they were pretty heavy overall during a time period where that was definitely a strong suit. The follow-up album, Bone Palace Ballet, really pushed that forward. It added a layer of polish to everything that they were doing. They experimented even more so. There's slower songs on here, but everything kind of just connects and comes together. It doesn't feel quite as rough as their first album, even though that was very well produced. Bone Palace Ballet definitely takes that to another level. The songwriting is definitely stronger on this album, and it really still holds up today as some of their best work that they've done. The opening track right off the bat really kind of captures you. It's dark, it's brooding. I really enjoy it. It's one of my favorite songs off of there. They just did such a great job with the follow-up, but I really think that it's something that they haven't really captured since. I know Craig Owens left the band. They did another album with him, and now I guess he's out again and they're somewhere floating, but it's really something that they kind of, I think, hit a high point with this album.
Number 9.
Number 9 is Every Time I Die with The Big Dirty. Now, I talked about this album in my Every Time I Die review series. This is their grimiest album that they've done. It just feels pretty gross in a lot of ways, but it's not a bad thing. It's not saying that you don't listen to this. It's just that feeling that you get. It just makes you feel dirty, or that they did this. I mean, lyrically, it's the most sarcastic album that they've done. There's just a ton of dry wit here. It really makes you just feel like you want to take a shower afterwards, as if you've traveled into this dusty old town and everything's just, coated in dust and grime and hasn't been touched in years. That's kind of the impression I get after listening to this album. It's really the best way. It's probably also one of the heavier albums that they've done in general, but it's really kind of the album that I think stepped things up. Gutter Phenomenon was a great transition from Hot Damn, which was kind of their breakout album, but I really think The Big Dirty is probably the best album that they've done so far. Well, maybe Low Teens might take that, but Big Dirty just really, in 2007, just did something that not a lot of bands were really doing. Really no band was doing at that point, and I think they've really pushed themselves with that album. And again, I still think it's their best album that they've done.
Number 8.
Number 8 is Mayday Parade with A Lesson in Romantics. Now, this album came out kind of really at the height of the whole scene emo thing that was going on with bands like The Maine or All Time Low, and I really think that they kind of stood out, and still this album really does stand out with just amongst those bands. I mean, it features just these hooks that are just catchier than duct tape. The vocal work is absolutely fantastic, the way it goes back and forth. I mean, if you were around during the time when this album came out and you heard this album, if you start hearing the opening of these songs, I mean, you're going to start singing along. That's just how good they were and how catchy they were. And it's an album I don't think I really appreciated when it came out, because I was kind of starting to drift away from that kind of music. But even today, I think I've kind of gone back to this album, and I think it really does stand out as a way of kind of capturing that whole indie rock, post-hardcore thing and mixing it with pop. And I think they absolutely did a great job at that.
Number 7.
Number 7 is Motion City Soundtrack's Even If It Kills Me. Now, this is an album of Motion City Soundtracks I think a lot of people kind of skip over or don't really even recognize. I mean, they had been on a roll with solid albums up until now, and I just think that people kind of, for whatever reason, didn't really capture this album. I mean, they released a couple singles off of it, I believe, but I just don't think it had as much momentum as their previous two albums, especially their first album. The movie kind of built a name for them, and their follow-up album to that was their big breakthrough album where everyone kind of knew their name. But Even If It Kills Me, I just think kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people. But going back to it, it's definitely one of their stronger albums. There's some fantastic songs on here. That rival the Everything Is Alright or The Future Freaks Me Out. There's definitely some singles on this album that really kind of show off the strengths of the band, and it kind of saw themselves pushing into a different direction as well. I think they really kind of were able to capture that mix of electronic pop and indie rock and punk and everything and bring it into this album. And for whatever reason, again, I just think that people kind of missed over it. But 10 years later, this album really does stand out in their discography as being one of the better albums.
Number 6.
Number 6 is Oh Sleeper with When I Am God. Now, 2007 was a time around when it was huge for Christian metal bands like Under Oath and Norma Jean coming out with some of their best work in 2006. And Oh Sleeper kind of joined the ranks at this point with When I Am God. And I consider it almost to be a perfect album. It's atmospheric, it's heavy, it's dark, it has a message to it. It's just absolutely fantastic. I mean, the guitar riffs on this album throughout are just ones that will stay stuck in your head. They are memorable. The screaming is fantastic. The clean vocal work, the way they bounce off, it's just so, it's absolutely great. The structure of the whole thing, they really did a great job with this album that they released, and for whatever reason, I just don't think that they have kind of captured that. It's just the atmosphere on here. There's really a mood that's set by this entire album that they really haven't kind of hit since. But in 2007, this album just blew everything away.
Number 5.
Number 5 is Say Anything's In Defense of the Genre. Now, Is a Real Boy was kind of this manic masterpiece. It really was just such a relatable album for a lot of people, especially in 2004 within the indie rock crowd, especially for people in my generation, I would say, who really kind of were drawn to it. It had this very kind of do-it-yourself rough edge of the indie rock scene to it, and I think that's why a lot of people also enjoyed it. It didn't feel like it was trying to do anything in the radio, even though there were some really catchy and poppy songs, even the most popular song on there, but it really didn't feel like it was trying in any way. But In Defense of the Genre, the follow-up to it, is a much different album. It features a huge layer of polish on here. There's an expansion of the sound. They did a lot more, and it kind of pushes more into the poppier side of things of indie rock versus As a Real Boy, which kind of felt more again towards the rock side of things with just not so much not caring. I mean, this album is huge, though. It's split actually among 2 CDs, so it really just is massive. It's almost 2 albums built into one, and it features a ton of guest vocalists on here from some of the biggest names at that time, and even today, like Hayley Williams or Gerard Way featured on some of the songs. I mean, it's definitely different than Is a Real Boy, which is, again, I feel like a lot of people kind of gravitated away from this album because of that polish, because of that poppiness, but it's still a fantastic album. I mean, there's some of the catchiest songs on here of that day, and they all do really hold up.
Number 4.
Number 4 is Sum 41's Underclass Hero. Now, Sum 41 had kind of been pushing into more heavier territory from their kind of punkish pop roots of their first album, All Killer No Filler. Does This Look Infected and Chuck kind of brought more metal side of things to it. And it was definitely a different approach, but Underclass Hero really kind of stripped that all away from the point when they released their first single, the title track off of this album. You really got a sense that they were doing something different, that they were kind of going back to their roots a bit and giving us a more poppier, pop punk, whatever you want to call it, kind of album. Now, the only thing that really held this album back, I think in a lot of ways, was I think at that point people were kind of gravitating away from Sum 41. I think people who liked their first album really hadn't stuck with them so much. That and the fact that it is a little bit derivative. It does feel like they are kind of mimicking in a lot of ways Green Day or Blink-182, but I really don't think it's a bad thing. I think they kind of overcome that. It's not so much a copy of them, it just feels influenced in a lot of ways, and that was kind of what was big at this point. But I really think it's definitely one of their better albums that they've done. There are some fantastic songs on it, and it still holds up.
Number 3.
Number 3 is The Used with Lies for the Liars. Now, The Used kind of, in their last album, In Love and Death, really kind of pushed more towards the poppier side of things. Their first album was a very kind of aggressive post-hardcore album. It was fairly heavy. There was screaming on it. In Love and Death, not so much. It was smoother, had more hooks to it. Some of the songs were straight up kind of pop songs. But it wasn't a bad album in a lot of ways, and I think it's a lot of people's favorite album because of that and because of the time it kind of came out in. Now, Lies for the Liars comes out, and it's an extremely heavy album overall. It's a much darker album. It's also a more experimental album in general, with songs like Paralyzed, for instance, or even the opening track, The Ripper. There's some different elements in there that they really hadn't done before. The single they released, The Bird and the Worm, kind of saw themselves pushing themselves forward, and it really was a better album than they've done in the past. I mean, their first album was great, a little bit rough. In Love and Death, again, took a different approach to things, but now we get Lies for the Liars, and I really just think it's their best album and a perfect album.
Number 2.
Number 2 is The Chariot with the Fiancé. Now, I talked about this album in my Chariot review series, and pretty much what I have to say is the same thing. I mean, it was a tremendous album. It took away from the heaviness of their first album, and it wasn't quite as off the wall as their follow-up albums. It was kind of right in that sweet spot where I think it definitely showed signs of differentiating themselves from other bands in the genre, but it was probably the closest that they've come to just pure metalcore. I mean, some of these songs on here are just pretty much, straight up kind of metalcore songs, and not as much experimental as they've really been doing even in the past and as they went going forward. But it's a fantastic point to jump in, and it's probably the most accessible Chariot album.
Number 1.
Number 1 is Streetlight Manifesto with Somewhere in the Between. Now, Streetlight Manifesto, their first couple albums were a little bit immature in a lot of ways. It was ska punk. I mean, they did a good job. One of them was just a copy of Tomas Kalnaki's previous band, Catch-22, but they're very, very strong songs. They just lacked an edge and maturity. Tomas Kalnaki's vocal work and lyricism on those albums were absolutely fantastic, but just overall the song structure and the songwriting was just a little bit lacking. It was a bit generic. It didn't really feel like they were doing much to separate themselves or kind of push themselves forward in any way. Now, Somewhere in the Between is a completely different story. Right off the bat, you get this very fantastic song. They have a way of just telling a story with the music itself, and again, Tomas Kalnaki's vocal work and his lyricism is probably some of the best in the business, the way he can throw a song together. And I think that this album in general is just themselves pushing themselves forward. They experimented a little bit. We get some pretty deep story-driven songs on here, and just these sarcastic lines, these deep lines. Overall, I just think that this album saw themselves pushing forward, and just again to even today, 10 years later, it's probably the strongest album that they've done. So those were my top 10 albums turning 10 for 2007. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Again, I do want to hear from you. What were your favorite albums and what did you think of my list?